HOA President Margaret Thorne hired a local handyman to bring a 15-foot aluminum ladder to my driveway and physically rip my American flag out of the wall of my own garage. She stood safely on the community sidewalk in her beige designer trench coat, clutching her HOA rulebook, watching with a smug, triumphant smile as the handyman used a pry bar to splinter the wood and tear the brass bracket down. She told me that the exterior wall of my home was a common aesthetic element, that my flag was an unauthorized modification, and that she was restoring order to the neighborhood. I looked at the splintered wood falling onto my driveway. I looked at the folded flag, honoring my grandfather's SY service, lying disrespectfully on the concrete. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten the handyman. I didn't even call the local sheriff. I just pulled out my phone, documented the exact damage to the wooden fascia, and made a call to the county sheriff's department. Because what Margaret didn't understand, what her arrogance blinded her to, was that she hadn't just vandalized a homeowner's garage. She had taken a pry bar to a federally protected display of the American flag. By the time the federal regulators were done with her little neighborhood enforcement project wouldn't just cost her the presidency of her HOA. It would earn her a $45,000 legal judgment that she would have to pay out of her own pocket. My name is Thomas Cooke. I am 65 years old, and before I retired, I spent 38 years working as a commercial title insurance underwriter. To most people, the world of title insurance sounds like a cure for insomnia. But in reality, it is the invisible ironclad foundation upon which all real estate wealth in this country is built. I didn't just read legal documents. I dissected them. I was the man who once halted a $70 million commercial high-rise development because I found a single, misplaced comma in a 1912 land grant that fundamentally altered the property's right-of-way. My days were spent in the windowless, climate-controlled basements of county archives, physically unrolling dusty, fragile plat maps dating back to the early 1900s. I traced forgotten surveyor lines, verified mineral rights passed down through generations, and cross-referenced thousands of pages of obscure municipal code. When you spend 4 decades ensuring that multi-million-dollar corporate acquisitions are legally impenetrable, you develop a very specific superpower. You become an absolute monster for the fine print. You learn that people assume a lot of things about the land they live on. They assume a fence marks the property line. They assume the sidewalk belongs to the city. They assume that because they pay dues to a homeowners association, the association possesses ultimate, untouchable authority over their domain. But in a federal courtroom, neighborhood assumptions are completely worthless. Only the paper matters. And the idea that a local HOA president with a spiral-bound aesthetic guideline pamphlet could legally outmaneuver a man who spent his life fortifying century-old property deeds was quite frankly absurd. 3 years ago, my wife and I decided it was time to downsize from our sprawling, high-maintenance property. We moved into Oak Crest, a planned residential community in Southern California. At first glance, it was an idyllic place to spend our golden years. It was quiet, the lawns were perfectly manicured, and it had a homeowners association. I am not inherently opposed to HO. They serve a functional purpose in preventing absolute neighborhood chaos. However, as a career title underwriter, I leave absolutely nothing to chance. I read the Oak Crest CT Anvers the covenants, conditions, and restrictions before I ever signed the closing documents. I knew exactly what I was agreeing to. I knew the limits of their jurisdiction, and more importantly, I knew the absolute, millimeter-precise legal boundaries of my own property rights. The very first thing I did when we moved in was mount a heavy, antique solid brass bracket to the wooden fascia board above my garage door. This wasn't a cheap plastic mount purchased on a whim from a hardware store. It was heavy, enduring, and historically significant. From that bracket, I flew a 3x5-foot American flag. It wasn't a cheap, thin nylon banner bought off the internet. It was a burial flag. Specifically, the burial flag presented to my grandmother on a bitterly cold afternoon in November, when my grandfather, a World War combat veteran, was laid to rest. I can still remember the exact sound of the Honor Guard S rifles cracking a 3-volley salute into the gray sky. I remember the crisp, synchronized movements of the soldiers in their white gloves as they pulled the heavy fabric taut, snapping it precisely into a tight, perfect triangle. When you hold a genuine military burial flag, the first thing you notice is the immense weight. It is made of dense, incredibly heavy, tightly woven cotton. For decades, it sat in a protective glass and cedar display case in my office, absorbing the faint, solemn scent of old wood, brass polish, and quiet history. It carried the unspoken weight of a man who waded through the freezing, blood-stained waters of Omaha Beach so that the rest of us could have the luxury of arguing about grass height in a free country. That folded triangle of heavy cotton was the ultimate symbol of his sacrifice, his courage, and the legacy he left for our bloodline. Taking it out of its case and flying, it was not merely an aesthetic choice, it was a deeply personal, daily tribute. I treated that flag with absolute uncompromising reverence. For 2 years, the flag flew there beautifully. Nobody complained. Nobody cared. It waved gently in the warm Southern California breeze, a quiet testament to a generation of heroes. But peace in a hyper-regulated suburban environment is often fragile. Then, a neighbor down the street decided to bolt a massive neon-colored San Diego Padres baseball flag to his roof during the playoffs. It was loud, it was obnoxious, and it was undeniably an eyesore. The neighborhood went crazy. This incident served as the perfect catalyst for ambitious neighborhood politicians. And the HOA board, led by newly elected President Margaret Thorne, went on a crusade. Margaret was a woman in her late 50s who treated the HOA rulebook like a holy text. From what I gathered during community meetings, she had retired from a mid-level corporate management position and desperately missed the sensation of micromanaging subordinates. She didn't just want a tidy neighborhood, she wanted absolute, unquestioned uniformity. Using the CC&Rs as her weapon, she forced the neighbor to take down the sports flag. The neighbor, lacking the legal knowledge to fight back, capitulated immediately. But Margaret didn't stop there. Like most petty tyrants, once she got a taste of power, she immediately looked for the next target. She became addicted to the compliance of her neighbors. She began patrolling the sidewalks, measuring grass height, inspecting the color of front doors, and issuing citations with ruthless efficiency. And inevitably, her crosshairs landed directly on the antique brass bracket above my garage. The harassment began with the cowardly anonymity typical of bureaucratic overreach. It started with a vibrant neon pink warning slip taped to my front door. The slip cited unauthorized exterior modification and demanded the immediate removal of my flag and the brass bracket. I peeled the paper off the wood, read the boilerplate language, and calmly dropped it into the recycling bin. I ignored it. I knew my rights, and I refused to legitimize an invalid demand with a response. But ignoring a neighborhood tyrant doesn't make them go away. It only injures their pride and forces them to escalate. A week later, I was watering my front flower beds when Margaret Thorne marched up my driveway, clutching her signature clipboard. She demanded I take the flag down, claiming the HOA owned the exterior envelope of my home. I calmly explained to her that she was confusing a maintenance easement with fee simple ownership. That brief factual lecture infuriated her. She spun on her heels, stormed back to her golf cart, and promised retribution. Most neighborhood disputes end there, fading into passive-aggressive glares across the street. But Margaret wasn't going to let it go. 3 days later, a private courier arrived at my door, holding a heavy certified envelope. It wasn't just a fine. It was a formal summons. I was being legally ordered to appear before an official disciplinary and compliance hearing at the Oak Crest clubhouse the following Thursday evening. This is where the slow, suffocating grind of administrative harassment truly begins. HOA boards use these hearings as a psychological weapon. They design them to make you feel isolated, outnumbered, and intimidated by their collective authority. But as a man who had spent his life navigating high-stakes commercial real estate litigation, I didn't feel intimidated. I felt an overwhelming sense of calm. Because Margaret Thorne wasn't just summoning me to a meeting. She was inviting me to permanently document her own malicious intent. On Thursday evening, I walked into the Oak Crest clubhouse, holding nothing but a single thin manila folder. The room was sterile, illuminated by harsh, buzzing overhead fluorescent lights. At the front of the room, seated behind a long, heavy folding table, was the HOA Board of Directors. They sat together like a suburban tribunal. Dead center, flanked by her nervous Vice President Greg, sat Margaret Thorne. She was wearing a tailored blazer, a smug smile, and holding a wooden gavel. "Mr. Cooke," Margaret announced loudly, as I took a seat in the empty row of folding chairs facing them. "You have been summoned before this board for maintaining an unauthorized exterior aesthetic violation. Do you have anything to say in your defense before we vote on punitive action?" I didn't stand up. I didn't raise my voice. I opened my manila folder. "Before I respond, Margaret," I said, my voice steady and echoing clearly in the quiet room, "I want to ensure that the board secretary is recording my statements verbatim for the official meeting minutes. Is the recording device active?" Greg, the vice president, blinked in surprise, fumbling with a small digital recorder on the table. Yes. Yes, Mr. Cooke, it is on the record." "Excellent," I replied. I pulled the first document from my folder and placed it gently on the table in front of them. "Let the record show that I am presenting the board with a certified copy of the property deed for my lot. As a retired title underwriter, let me translate the legal language for you. This deed proves absolute fee simple ownership of the physical structure of my garage. The HOA only possesses a maintenance easement. You do not own my walls. And you have absolutely no legal right to alter, touch, or damage my private property." Margaret rolled her eyes, scoffing loudly. "We are not here to debate your amateur legal theories, Thomas," she snapped, physically pushing the deed away without even glancing at it. I ignored her completely and pulled out the second document. I laid it carefully next to the first. "Let the record further show," I continued, my tone dropping to a cold, clinical precision, "that I am providing the board with a printed copy of the freedom to display the American Flag Act of 2005. This is a federal law passed by the United States Congress. It explicitly prohibits any homeowners association from restricting a resident from displaying the U.S. flag on property they own. I am officially warning this board on the recorded minutes that any attempt to remove my grandfather's burial flag or its bracket is not only a trespass on private property, but a direct violation of federal civil rights." The room fell dead silent. Greg looked down at the federal statute, his face turning slightly pale. He reached out a hand to pick it up, but Margaret instantly slammed her hand down on the paper, stopping him. Her face was flushed red with sheer, unadulterated arrogance, while she refused to be undermined in front of her committee. "I don't need a history lesson, and I certainly don't care what you printed off the internet, Mr. Cooke," Margaret hissed, her voice vibrating with toxic authority. "When you bought a house in Oak Crest, you signed a contract agreeing to abide by our architectural guidelines. Our CK&Rs govern this community. Not you." She picked up her wooden gavel, her eyes locked onto mine with a look of absolute blind superiority. "The grace period is over," she declared. "The board officially votes to impose a $100 daily fine. Furthermore, if this unauthorized structure is not gone by Monday morning, the board formally votes to exercise our right of self-help to abate the violation ourselves." She slammed the gavel down onto the table. Bang. Meeting adjourned, she announced proudly. I didn't argue. I didn't try to reason with her anymore. I just gave a slow, quiet nod, picked up my empty manila folder, and walked out of the clubhouse. As I walked back to my house under the streetlights, I felt a deep, profound sense of closure. Margaret thought she had just won a dominant victory. She had no idea that she had just committed legal suicide. By formally dismissing my deed, ignoring the federal statute on the record, and officially voting to physically alter my property, she had just handed me the ultimate weapon. Premeditation. If she damaged my wall now, it wouldn't be an accident. It wouldn't be an administrative error. It would be an intentional, malicious, and heavily documented crime. The trap was perfectly set. All I had to do now was wait for her to step into it. The weekend approached with an eerie suburban silence. Friday came and went. The flag stayed up. I went about my life, fully prepared for whatever move Margaret decided to make. On Monday morning, at exactly 8:14 a.m., the automated motion monitoring system on my phone went off like a fire alarm. I checked the live 4K feed. A beat-up white work van had parked in front of my house. A contractor in a high-visibility shirt was setting up an aluminum ladder directly against my private garage door. Standing safely on the community sidewalk, pointing a manicured finger up at my flag, was Margaret Thorne. She wasn't bluffing. She had actually hired a handyman to trespass onto my property. I walked to my front window and watched entirely hidden behind the blinds. The handyman climbed the ladder. Because my bracket was installed with heavy-duty lag bolts, he couldn't just unscrew it. He took a heavy steel pry bar and aggressively jammed it behind the solid brass plate. With a violent, sickening crack that echoed down the quiet street, he splintered the wooden fascia board, ripping the bracket and the flag right out of the wall. The heavy brass and the folded fabric tumbled down, hitting my concrete driveway with a heavy thud. Margaret smiled, marked something off on her clipboard, and turned to walk away. I didn't run outside shouting. I didn't engage in a chaotic screaming match on the lawn. Instead, I walked over to my desk, retrieved a pair of clean white cotton gloves I kept specifically for my grandfather's effects, and stepped out the front door. The morning air was still. I walked past the terrified handyman, ignoring him entirely, and knelt down on the cold, oil-stained concrete of my driveway. Margaret stopped on the sidewalk and turned around. She watched me, a smug, triumphant smile plastered across her face, fully believing my silence was an act of total submission to her authority. She had no idea she was watching the quiet calm before a legal execution. Wearing the white cotton gloves, I carefully picked up the heavy, folded cotton of my grandfather's burial flag. I slowly brushed the driveway dirt and concrete dust off the embroidered stars. With deliberate, reverent movements, I tightened the fabric back into a perfect, respectful triangle, holding it tightly against my chest. I stood up, looked Margaret dead in the eyes with absolutely zero emotion, pulled out my smartphone, and dialed the county sheriff. "Yes, I need a deputy at my residence," I said calmly. "I have a contractor actively vandalizing the structural exterior of my home, and the individual who hired him to commit the crime is still on the scene." 20 minutes later, a heavy-duty marked police cruiser rolled to a stop on my driveway. Deputy John Hayes stepped out. Hayes was a tall, stern man in his late 40s, possessing the weary, no-nonsense demeanor of an officer who had spent decades dealing with suburban disputes. He didn't treat my driveway like a homicide scene, but he did his job strictly by the book. He pulled a standard digital camera from his vehicle and took clear, methodical photographs of the splintered wood and the heavy brass bracket lying on the concrete. It was routine police work, but it was exactly the documentation I needed. Then, Hayes turned his attention to the handyman, Rick, who was sitting on the bumper of his van, shaking like a leaf. "Did you do this?" Hayes asked, his voice cold and authoritative. Rick broke down completely. "I didn't want to do it, officer. She told me it was an HO, a common wall," Rick pleaded, pointing a trembling finger at Margaret. "I warned her. Those bolts were deep in the studs. I told her the wood would splinter if I forced it. But she just said she was the president, that the removal was authorized, and to pry it off anyway." Margaret, who had rushed back to the scene, scoffed loudly. "Officer, do not listen to him. This is simply an aesthetic correction on a common element. I am the HOA president." Deputy Hayes slowly lowered his camera and turned to face her. "Ma'am," Hayes said, his voice dropping to a tired, serious register. "This isn't a landscaping dispute. You didn't trim a bush overhanging the sidewalk. You ordered a contractor to force heavy hardware off a private residential wall, knowing it would cause damage. That is criminal mischief and trespassing." Margaret's smug smile instantly vanished. You can't be serious." "What's an HOA matter?" she stammered. I stepped forward, handing my tablet to Deputy Hayes. "Officer, here is the deed proving fee simple ownership of that wall. And here is the 4K video with audio, proving premeditated conspiracy to commit property destruction." I paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in. Furthermore, the item she ordered destroyed was a United States burial flag, protected under the freedom to display the American Flag Act of 2005. Hayes looked at the video, looked at the federal statute, and then locked eyes with Margaret. "Miss Thorne," Hayes said coldly, pulling out a heavy pad of criminal incident reports. "You didn't just enforce a neighborhood rule. We've got a documented property crime here and a potential federal civil rights violation. I am filing a formal criminal report, and I highly suggest you retain a very good defense attorney." Margaret stared at the yellow carbon paper Hayes handed her like it was a live grenade. The absolute power she thought she wielded had just evaporated upon contact with actual law enforcement. But a police report for trespassing was just the appetizer. The main course was the federal court system. There is an old saying in commercial title insurance: assumptions always find the path of least resistance. But in a federal courtroom, the truth doesn't run on assumptions. It follows the paper trail. By the end of that first week, Deputy Hayes and the county sheriff's department had issued a formal notice of criminal vandalism. But the criminal report was only the beginning. The next morning, my attorney, Marcus Reed, filed a massive civil lawsuit against both the Oak Crest HO and Margaret Thorne personally. We sued for trespass, destruction of private residential infrastructure, and interference under the freedom to display the American Flag Act of 2005. When the board of directors received the lawsuit, they were terrified. But Margaret remained aggressively stubborn. She told the board not to panic, proudly reminding them that the HOA possessed a $2 million general liability insurance policy. She genuinely believed that her corporate insurance would simply write a check, hire a high-priced defense attorney, and make me go away. She was relying on her insurance as an impenetrable shield. And my decades in the insurance industry taught me exactly how to dismantle it. In civil litigation, before you ever step foot inside a courtroom, you enter the discovery phase. This is the brutal, unforgiving process where attorneys can legally demand access to internal records. Marcus didn't just ask nicely. He filed a sweeping federal subpoena, legally forcing the Oak Crest Management Office to surrender every single email, text message, and financial ledger related to my property. It took us 3 days to sift through the boxes of printed records and digital files. We sat at my heavy oak dining table late into the night, drinking black coffee, hunting for the fatal flaw. On the third night, Marcus leaned back in his chair, took off his wire-rimmed glasses, and slid a single printed email across the polished wood of the table. "Thomas," Marcus said, a quiet, predatory smile crossing his face. We found the smoking gun. I put on my reading glasses and looked at the paper. It was an email sent from Margaret Thorne's official HOA account to Rick's Handyman Services, time-stamped at 11:45 p.m. the night before the vandalism. I read her exact words out loud. Rick, per our previous conversation, proceed with the forced abatement of the bracket at the Cooke residence immediately. The homeowner is non-compliant. If the lag bolts strip the fascia board during extraction, you are to continue the removal regardless. The HOA board fully authorizes this action. We will route any resulting property damage claims through our general liability policy. Do not engage with the homeowner. Just get the display down. I looked up at Marcus. She put her malice in writing. While she handed us premeditation wrapped in corporate jargon, Marcus confirmed. And she is about to find out exactly how insurance underwriters handle premeditated crimes. 2 weeks later, a preliminary mediation hearing was scheduled at a downtown law office. Margaret arrived in a tailored navy blue suit, looking completely unfazed, projecting an air of upper-class invincibility. She sat at the heavy mahogany conference table, flanked by Greg, the nervous vice president, and the rest of the HOA board. But the lawyer sitting next to Margaret wasn't from the HOA's insurance company. He was a private defense attorney she had been forced to hire out of pocket. Before the mediator could even formally open the session, a representative from the HOA's corporate liability insurance carrier walked into the room. He was a very thin, severe-looking man holding a heavy black leather briefcase. He didn't sit down. He reached into his briefcase and slid a thick certified legal document directly across the table to Margaret. Miss Thorne, the insurance lawyer said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. The carrier is formally issuing a declaratory judgment of denial of coverage. Margaret's head snapped up, her arrogant smile finally faltering. What are you talking about? She demanded, her voice shrill. We pay our premiums. You are legally required to defend the board. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, looking down at her with absolute corporate coldness. General liability policies are designed to protect against accidents, negligence, and administrative errors, he explained, speaking slowly so every word landed like a physical blow. However, under Clause 4, Section B, our policy contains an intentional acts exclusion. He pulled a copy of Margaret's smoking gun email from his folder and placed it face up on the table. During the discovery phase, plaintiff's counsel subpoenaed this email. You explicitly directed a contractor to proceed with a forced abatement, explicitly acknowledging that it would strip the wood, and you plan to use this policy to cover the intentional damage. Mrs. Thorne, you did not make an administrative mistake. You knowingly authorized property damage. The insurance lawyer tapped the email with his pen. The insurance carrier does not subsidize intentional vandalism. We hold no duty to defend you and absolutely no duty to indemnify you. Your policy is voided for this incident. You are entirely on your own. The silence in the conference room was absolute, suffocating, and deafening. I watched the realization hit Margaret. It was like watching a fortress collapse in extreme slow motion. She looked frantically at her private defense attorney, begging him to intervene, but he just stared at the floor, knowing the case was legally dead. Then, the true mutiny began. Greg, the vice president, had been staring at the printed email on the table. His face turned from pale white to furious red. He realized instantly that Margaret's actions were about to bankrupt the HOA and drag the entire board into a federal conspiracy charge. Greg violently pushed his chair back and stood up, pointing a shaking finger directly at Margaret. You lied to us, Greg shouted, completely abandoning any sense of neighborhood decorum. You told the board this was a routine aesthetic compliance check. You sat in my living room and swore you were just having a contractor issue a standard removal. You didn't tell us you explicitly ordered a man to destroy a load-bearing residential wall with a pry bar. Margaret shrank back in her chair, her eyes wide with sheer panic. Greg, please, we have to stand united, she pleaded, her voice trembling. United? Greg spat, looking at her with pure disgust. You committed a property crime and tried to use our treasury to pay for it. The board is cutting all ties with you right now, Margaret. You are acting rogue. We will not pay a single cent of your legal fees. The other board members vigorously nodded, in agreement, physically inching their heavy leather chairs away from her as if she were radioactive. Margaret Thorne sat in total crushing isolation. Her HOA title, the ultimate shield she had used to terrorize her neighbors for years, was gone. The insurance company had dropped her. Her own board had violently betrayed her to save themselves. She was no longer the untouchable president of Oak Crest. She was just a civilian, legally naked, facing the uncompromising weight of the Federal Flag Act and tens of thousands of dollars in personal liability. And sitting across the table, my attorney, Marcus Reed, calmly clicked his pen. He opened his legal pad, ready to present the final bill. The mediator didn't speak loudly. He didn't need to. When a legal settlement is about to dismantle someone's life, it usually happens with a very quiet, very terrifying calm. We were in the downtown mediation office on a Tuesday morning. The appointed legal mediator sat behind the heavy mahogany table, looking down at a stack of documents that proved Margaret Thorne had conspired to destroy my property, trespass on private land, and violate federal civil rights. Margaret sat alone at the defense side. Her high-priced attorney was there, of course, but emotionally, she was on an island. The HOA board members sat at the far end of the room, distancing themselves as if her arrogance was a contagious disease. The mediator adjusted his glasses and looked directly at her. Miss Thorne, the mediator began, his voice echoing in the silent room. In my 22 years of practice, I have rarely seen a property dispute driven by such calculated malice. You did not make an administrative error. You manufactured a crisis. You destroyed residential infrastructure and caused a severe violation of federal rights, all to enforce your own personal neighborhood aesthetic. Margaret kept her eyes glued to the table, her knuckles white. Because your actions were intentional and illegal, the mediator continued, your association's liability insurance does not apply. You are personally and entirely responsible for the consequences of your orders. Then, he dropped the hammer. You will be required to sign a legally binding agreement, resigning from the board, and never running for community office again. Grandly, he turned a page. You will be required to pay the contractor fees to fully repair the splintered wood and structural fascia you destroyed with a pry bar. He turned one final page, looking over at Marcus and me. And to settle Mr. Cooke's federal civil suit, you will pay the remaining balance to cover the exorbitant attorney fees, the statutory damages under the Flag Act, and the installation of a new, reinforced bracket. I did the math in my head. $45,000. Margaret let out a sharp, breathless gasp, pressing her hand against her mouth. Sir, her attorney spoke up, his voice lacking any real conviction. My client does not have the liquid assets to satisfy a settlement of this magnitude. It will bankrupt her. The mediator didn't even blink. Then I suggest she list her home for sale, counselor, the mediator replied coldly. Or we take this to federal court and secure a lien on it for her. We are adjourned. As the conference room emptied, nobody approached Margaret. The board members behind the strict aesthetic guidelines had vanished the moment the federal lawsuit got involved. They quietly withdrew their support and cut all ties with her, leaving Margaret holding the bag. Outside the office, Greg, the former vice president of the HOA, walked over to Marcus and me. He looked exhausted. Mr. Cooke, Greg said, extending a hesitant hand. The board held an emergency election last night. Margaret was formally removed. I've taken over as interim president. I just want to say, we never wanted this. We just wanted a quiet neighborhood. I shook his hand firmly. Reg, I said, a quiet neighborhood is exactly what you'll have, as long as your community guidelines stay on your side of the property line. He nodded vigorously. You have my word. Nobody from this HOA will ever step foot near your garage wall again. True to the settlement's word, the financial crushing of Margaret Thorne was absolute. Faced with $45,000 in federal and civil penalties, and with no insurance company to bail her out, her pristine life in Oak Crest unraveled. 6 weeks later, a bright red for sale sign went up on the manicured lawn of her house. She couldn't afford the legal fees, the settlement, or the humiliation. She sold the house at a loss, packed up her golf cart, and moved away. The woman who had tried to dictate what her neighbors could put on their walls had been evicted by her own arrogance. By late September, the autumn air brought a crisp, welcome breeze to the California suburbs. Out on my driveway, the master carpenter had finished his work. The splintered wood and damaged fascia had been completely repaired. The wall looked pristine over the smooth concrete once again, and the structure had returned to the exact specifications of the original build. Up on the garage, the bracket had been mounted. I didn't just replace the antique brass bracket. Using Margaret's settlement money, I hired a crew to forge a massive 1/4-inch steel backing plate. We bolted it deep into the structural studs, far beyond the wooden fascia, and encased the mounting bolts in reinforced steel. It was virtually indestructible. And yes, it was still bold. But it was a boldness that belonged to me. I stood by the driveway one evening, watching the sun dip behind the houses, casting long shadows over the pavement. Above me, my grandfather's burial flag waved peacefully, flying deep into the evening breeze, entirely unbothered by the war that had been fought over its display. My grandfather used to tell me that freedom doesn't belong to governments. Governments belong to the people. You can draw lines on a plat map, you can print glossy HOA brochures, and you can carry a clipboard until your knuckles bleed. But paper doesn't move mountains. Paper doesn't stop a patriot. And paper certainly doesn't override the laws of property or the Federal Flag Act. Margaret Thorne thought a title gave her the right to dictate the exterior of a home. Instead, she learned the hardest lesson the American suburbs has to offer. You never ever mess with a homeowner's property. If you've ever dealt with an entitled HOA board member who thought their community rules carried more weight than actual federal law, I want to hear your story in the comments. And if you believe that a family deed, a property right, and the harsh reality of the legal system should always crush a bully with a clipboard, hit that subscribe button. Stay tuned to Property Line Justice, because there will always be another boundary that needs the truth read out loud.